Being a sales clerk in a retail store in the United States can be kind of unrewarding. You get paid low wages, you's on your feet for hours at a time, and sometimes you has to deal with customers like Greg Koukl. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. And today we get into the main body of the book, starting with Chapter 1, entitled Diplomacy or D-Day. And I think we're going to discover that Greg has some pretty peculiar notions of what diplomacy is. The chapter opens with a topic that's very familiar to a lot of evangelical Christians, namely the fear of evangelism. Quote, "We wade into battle only to face a barrage of objections we can't handle. We have ignored one of the first rules of engagement. Never make a frontal assault on a superior force. Caught off balance, we tuck our tails between our legs, maybe for good." End quote. And notice the superior force here is us skeptics. We's the ones bringing evidence and reason to bear, and believers is the ones retreating, at least in Greg's illustration. Now, of course, he thinks he's got a solution to this situation, and he's going to tell us in a minute. But first, ain't this peculiar? Is this really the sort of predicament you'd expect Christians to have if they actually had an honest-to-goodness almighty deity who had all wisdom and knowledge and desired all men to be saved? If God's the most powerful force in the universe and he wants us to believe in him, then demonstrating his existence ought to be the easiest thing in the world. Proving the existence of the moon ought to be a more difficult challenge by comparison. And yet the default situation for believers is that they's retreating from a superior force consisting of a single skeptic armed with facts and reason. Kinda makes you think, don't it? Koukl openly acknowledges that believers can't expect to win by a direct frontal assault, so he recommends what he calls diplomacy, or in other words, being sneaky. Quote, "In this book, I would like to teach you how to be diplomatic, able to navigate smoothly and graciously through hazardous encounters. I want to suggest a model that I call the ambassador model. I am going to teach you how to navigate in conversations so that you stay in control, in a good way, even though your knowledge is limited." End quote. As his examples will show, the ambassador in his model is the kind of friendly, inoffensive diplomat who shows up to social functions wearing a hidden microphone so he can glean sensitive information that he can use against you. And you gotta love how he takes pains to emphasize that you's gonna stay in control, quote, in a good way, unquote. Like, he knows he's being sneaky and manipulative, but hey, it's all for the glory of God, so it's okay, right? Never mind that they wouldn't need to be so underhanded if God was actually real. He moves on to a story about a salesperson he met once in a store in Wisconsin, and he noticed that she was wearing a pentagram necklace. And nothing triggers a conservative evangelical Christian like seeing that they's non-Christians out in public, so he decides to go after her. He asks about the necklace and gets her to admit that she's a pagan, which causes his wife to openly gasp in shock. She apologizes, of course, but her reaction prompts the saleslady to explain that Wicca is an earth religion that respects all life. Well, she don't know it, but she's just made her first tactical error, and Greg is quick to pounce. Quote, "If you respect all life," I ventured, "then I suppose you're pro-life on the abortion issue." She shook her head. "No, actually, I'm not. I'm pro-choice." I was surprised. Isn't that an unusual position for someone in Wicca to take? I mean, since you're committed to respecting all life? End quote. And boom, gotcha. So, several observations here. First, he says he was surprised, but was he really? Or is this exactly the response he was hoping for? What would he have said if she'd responded that yes, she was pro-life? Second, notice the power dynamic here. Greg is a customer, and the lady is in a customer service position. In American culture, there's an unfortunate but common perception that the customer is always right, which puts considerable pressure on the salesperson to be polite and accommodating to whatever views the customer expresses. And Greg's using this to unfair advantage. Third, notice that this don't have nothing to do with whether or not God is real or whether Jesus died to save us from our sins or even whether this particular lady is a sinner. Abortion is a culture wars issue exploited by Republican political operatives in the 1970s and onwards in order to drive a highly emotional wedge between conservatives and liberals, and especially between evangelical Christians and liberals. With the help of prominent televangelists like Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, and D. James Kennedy, the pro-life movement became a driving force behind the push to unite evangelical Christianity with a right-wing patriarchal political agenda. And we can see today just how effective that strategy has been. Highly charged emotional rhetoric aside, though, there's nothing inherently Christian about the pro-life position. In the history of the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's been a number of widely accepted notions concerning when life begins. And the idea that life begins at conception is actually fairly recent, at least as a dominant dogma. The oldest tradition is the idea that a man becomes a living soul when he draws his first breath. And in fact, in Hebrew, the word for spirit and the word for breath is the same word. We even see this same mentality reflected in language today. Inspiration and respiration and expiration is all based on the root word spirit. And of course, this fits perfectly with the Christian notion that our physical bodies is just vessels temporarily inhabited by an immortal spirit. So a pro-choice position would be perfectly compatible with a traditional view of Christianity that was untainted by patriarchal right-wing political agendas, which means that Greg's vector of attack here ain't really about Christianity at all. It's about right-wing culture wars. And the lady is caught off guard. Quote, "You're right, it is odd," she admitted. Then she qualified herself. "I know that I could never do that," she said, referring to abortion. "I could never kill a baby. I wouldn't do anything to hurt someone else because it might come back on me." End quote. And she falls right into Greg's little trap. Now, just a caveat here. Stories told by apologists frequently follow a formula where the apologist has all the brilliant answers and the other person is always struggling to keep up. And real-life discussions is seldom so neat and simple. I'd say there's a fair chance that parts of this story is being rephrased to better fit a predetermined narrative. But she likely did make her second tactical error in this discussion by associating abortion with killing a baby. And Greg ain't gonna let that one go. Quote, "By her own admission, abortion was baby killing. The phrase wasn't a rhetorical flourish of mine, this was her own description. For the rest of the conversation, I abandoned the word abortion. It would be baby killing instead." End quote. So he's got a chance to use emotionally manipulative language, and he gleefully seizes on it. And again, let's remember that this is a culture wars issue, not a religious issue per se. It's about patriarchy, not salvation. Ironically, at this point, Greg inserts the following parenthetical, indented and in italic type. Quote, "Beware when rhetoric becomes a substitute for substance. You always know that a person has a weak position when he tries to accomplish with clever use of words what argument alone cannot do." End quote. Greg intends this to be a caution about the use of the phrase pro-choice, but it's actually far more appropriate as a caution against the phrase pro-life, because folks who's pro-choice is advocating the position that the woman should have the final choice regarding what happens to her own body, whereas the actual agenda of the so-called pro-life movement is a reestablishment of patriarchal roles that subordinate women and deny them their right to bodily autonomy. We can see this in the lack of pro-life support for things like publicly funded prenatal care and support for single moms and so on. And we also see it in the fact that the fourth leading cause of infant death worldwide right now is American-made bombs being dropped on Palestinian civilians, with nary a people protest from the so-called pro-life community. It ain't about the well-being of babies. It's about degrading and subordinating women. And let me add an aside here that may be controversial to some, but I'm going to say it. It's time for us to drop the abortion debate. We've lost it. Emotions is too high and the polarization too deep to overcome, and recent elections proves it. But I ain't saying to give up, not by a long shot. I say it's time to use some tactics of our own, and that means reframing it as a debate over forced pregnancy. Because forced pregnancy is a form of sexual assault. Anytime you use violence or the threat of violence to take control of someone else's genitals and use them against their will, it's a sexual assault, especially if it endangers them physically or psychologically. That's the hill that we need to take our stand on, and it's a position that pro-life folks ain't got a good answer to. Say all the bad things you want about abortion, it don't give you the right to sexually assault somebody. You think a fetus is a baby? Well, you're technically wrong because a fetus has a placenta and a baby don't. But regardless of whether you're right or wrong, your opinions don't give you the right to sexually assault somebody. And that means if you want to fight abortion, your only ethical option is to do so by providing kids with comprehensive sex education and freely available contraception. Preventing unwanted pregnancies is 100% effective in preventing abortions except in cases of medical necessity. And it's the only option that don't involve sexually assaulting innocent folks. Okay, close parenthesis, down off my soapbox and back to Greg. I'll just summarize the rest of the story because from here I want to focus on what Greg thinks is the lessons we ought to learn. But the gist of the rest of the story is this. The poor lady, trying to be polite to a customer, tries to explain her position regarding women having the right to choose what's done to their own bodies, but Greg won't let her. Instead, he keeps harping on the idea of baby killing and asks her what would make it okay for a woman to kill her own baby. So she thinks about it and she says, well, incest. And I doubt very much that this conversation happened in the terms Greg is using to describe it. He's presenting this lady and her arguments in the worst possible light, and he's giving his own arguments his best polish. I'm sure, for example, that the lady actually said that abortion should be allowed in the case of incest, not that incest would give a woman a right to kill her own baby. But to Greg, they's both the same thing, which tells us that Greg believes abortion should be outlawed even in cases of rape or incest. And he makes that clear by asking the woman whether it'd be okay to kill a 2-year-old who had been conceived by incest, as if that was the same thing. And not surprisingly, she ain't got a good answer. I mean, for crying out loud, she's a salesperson taking folks' orders for photo printouts. She's not a debater or a philosopher. And at this point, Greg becomes conscious of the fact that he's holding up the line and other folks is starting to get impatient, but he's satisfied that he's put this woman in her place, so he lets the conversation go. And holy cow, he wants to teach other Christians to be this big of a jerk in public spaces. It's no wonder retail sales has such a high turnover. Greg's summary of this encounter is both cluelessly self-absorbed and self-righteous. Quote, first, there was no tension, no anxiety, and no awkwardness in the exchange. There were no lines drawn in the sand and no one vigorously protecting their turf. There was no confrontation, no defensiveness, and no discomfort. End quote. And it should go without saying that what Greg's talking about here is his own personal experience, not hers. He clearly has no idea what he just put this poor woman through. He felt like he was being non-confrontational and non-defensive, even though the whole conversation happened because he was triggered by her pentagram necklace, and he felt no discomfort because he was hopped up on his own sense of self-righteousness. But I think the lady would give a very different account of this conversation. Lesson number 2 that Greg takes from this encounter is the importance of dominating the conversation. Quote, second, even with the relaxed atmosphere, I was in the driver's seat the entire time. I was able to stay there calmly and thoughtfully, but using 3 important tactics to probe the young woman's ideas and challenge her faulty thinking. End quote. And believe it or not, folks know when one person is quote-unquote driving a conversation instead of being genuinely friendly. Greg's positive recollection of how this conversation went is due to his own conviction that he's the one in the right here. He may be congratulating himself on how polite and friendly he perceives himself as having been, but make no mistake, this is Christian privilege asserting itself full force, and he's proud of it. That's why he feels that it went so well. Next lesson, quote, "Third, I tried to help her see the logical consequences of her convictions. For her, incest was a legitimate reason to kill a baby. But when asked if it was legitimate to kill a toddler for the same reason, she balked, even though, strictly speaking, this was fully consistent with her view." End quote. Well, more precisely, what Greg did here was to combine a false equivalent with a classic blood libel. Exercising bodily autonomy by terminating a pregnancy and murdering a toddler is two very different situations. Firstly, because a fetus and a baby is different things, and secondly, because you don't need to sexually assault nobody to allow the toddler to live. By declaring these two situations to be the same thing, Greg is indulging in the time-honored tradition of Christian blood libel, accusing their victims of murdering babies for sinful purposes. Originally used against the Jews during the Inquisition, it's a form of slander that has seen renewed popularity as a way of attacking liberals and others who support women's rights. And the last lesson, quote, "The last thing I want you to notice about our conversation is critical. The witch in Wisconsin was doing most of the work. The only effort on my part was to pay attention to her responses and steer the exchange in the direction I wanted to go, which was not hard at all using my tactics." End quote. And that's the thing about using scripted evangelism. The folks who's figured out the scripts has figured out how to make it easy to use the script, and in Greg's book, that counts as a plus. It may be disingenuous and manipulative, but hey, it's easy, so that's all good, right? Greg goes on to add that because his script was so easy to use, he felt no pressure to try and force the gospel itself into the conversation. Having been triggered by her pentagram necklace, he was content just to use a politically motivated blood libel to put her on the spot and embarrass her in a situation where her job required her to respond politely, no matter how rudely he treated her. Way to go, Greg. Greg goes on to make a distinction between strategy and tactics. Under strategy, he includes what he calls, quote, "offensive apologetics," end quote. That is, books that make a positive case for Christianity, and quote-unquote defensive apologetics, meaning books that defend Christianity from attacks against the reliability of the Bible and against what Greg calls, quote, Darwinian macroevolution, end quote, and other stuff like that. Strategy is good, says Greg, but believers also need a good set of tactics, and that, of course, is the focus of his book. And he includes this caveat, quote, "Tactics are not manipulative tricks or slick ruses. They are not clever ploys to embarrass other people and force them to submit to your point of view. They are not meant to belittle or humiliate those who disagree with you so you can gain notches in your spiritual belt." End quote. And the reason he takes the trouble to deny that this is what tactics are is because, as he demonstrated with the witch, this is exactly what his tactics is. He used manipulative tricks to embarrass the poor young woman and make her feel that her own views was socially repugnant under circumstances where she was both unprepared and under pressure to be nice. Greg readily admits that his tactics can be used to make other folks look silly, and he cautions his readers not to use them in a bad way. And I agree with that advice, with the caveat that the best way not to use these tactics to make folks look silly is not to use these tactics at all. He also admits that in the story of the witch and in future stories he's going to be telling in later chapters, he's doing considerable editing in order to make his point stand out better. Par for the course for apologetic anecdotes, up to and including rephrasing the other person's point of view in order to maximize how bad it looks. Nothing new here. Finally, he reassures his readers that they should persevere even if they find out that the other person knows a whole lot more about the subject than they do. Just ignore the points they bring up and keep looking for a vulnerability you can exploit using one of Greg's tactics. And sooner or later, he promises, you'll find something you can use. And that's a key point, because it focuses the believer's attention away from the facts that the other person is bringing up. As long as you keep brushing past the evidence and concentrate your attention on looking for vulnerabilities to exploit, your faith is safe from the challenges that the evidence might otherwise pose. Now, Greg don't say it in those words, but that's the strategy he's promoting here. So that's chapter 1. And before we close, I want to go back over some of the counter tactics we can use to try and nullify Greg's bag of tricks and maybe even stimulate some thoughtful reflection on the part of the believer. And counter tactic number 1, first and foremost, is not to ask questions to challenge the other person's views. If and we has a well-informed opinion on a particular topic, we should politely explain what we believe and why, without implying any obligation on the other person's part to agree with us. That this is an underappreciated and incredibly influential approach that has a strong chance of persuading the other person by not trying to persuade them. Confidence and gentleness are tremendously impressive, even when the other person is steeped in dogma and prone to polarized thinking. And I can't recommend it enough. Secondly, we should deconstruct our own beliefs and get to a point where we can clearly state what we believe and why. And okay, if some believer catches us off guard and asks us about a topic we ain't prepared to discuss, it's fine to say, that's a good point, I'll have to look into that. It'll give the believer a sense of hope that maybe they're scoring some points with you, but I guarantee that if you do a little bit of research, you'll find other folks who's already got good answers to whatever point the believer's trying to make. Apologetics ain't got nothing new, and it don't take all that much effort to Google the answer. And lastly, remember that you can always say that you just don't find a particular apologetic convincing and leave it at that. You don't have to give a conclusive rebuttal to everything. You've had a lifetime of experiences that's taught you things you might not even be aware of. And when someone tells you stuff that just don't sound consistent with real life as you've experienced it, then you're free to just say so. And I'm sure that there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, we'll start chapter 2, in which Greg is going to talk about some reservations folks might have, and I'm sure it's going to be revealing. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.